At Thanksgiving, my dad told me, "Your brother needs the family restaurant, so you're giving him your share." I set my fork down and said, "Then he should know what I found in the books." The first thing I noticed was that nobody at the table seemed surprised when my dad said I was giving my share of the restaurant to my brother. I was surprised, not because my dad had never favored my brother before. He had. I had spent most of my adult life pretending it wasn't as obvious as it was. What surprised me was the way my dad said it, like the decision had already been made. My fork was halfway to my mouth when he put his napkin beside his plate, looked directly at me, and told me my brother needed the family restaurant, so I was going to give him my share. I remember setting the fork down because I suddenly didn't trust myself not to drop it. The restaurant was the reason our family had stayed close for so many years. At least, that's what I used to believe. It was a small, busy American diner that my parents had bought when I was a kid. It wasn't fancy. We had cracked vinyl booths, a counter with 12 stools, a kitchen that always smelled faintly like bacon no matter what time of day it was, and an old neon sign in the front window that had been repaired so many times that I could identify every replacement tube. My dad had spent nearly 40 years working there. My mom had handled the books for most of that time. My brother Evan had eventually taken over day-to-day management. I had never wanted to run the place. That part is important. I wasn't sitting there secretly dreaming about taking the restaurant away from my brother. I had my own career. I worked full-time, had a mortgage, and had spent years building a life that had very little to do with the restaurant except for holidays, family birthdays, and the occasional Saturday when my dad needed help with something. But my parents had always told me that I owned half of it. Not metaphorically. Legally, my dad had transferred his ownership interest into an LLC years earlier and eventually divided the membership interests between me and Evan. My brother had the larger operational role, but I still owned my half. There were documents. There were tax records, there were annual statements, there were plenty of boring things that I never thought would matter, until that Thanksgiving. My mom was sitting across from me. My brother was beside my dad. My brother's wife was sitting next to him. My aunt and uncle were at the other end of the table. Nobody was eating anymore, even the kids had gone quiet. My dad told me that Evan had put everything into the restaurant and deserved to have complete control. He said I wasn't interested in running it anyway. He said the family needed to think about the future. He said giving Evan my share would keep the restaurant and the family. I remember looking at my brother because I expected him to look uncomfortable. He didn't. He looked nervous but not surprised. That was the first moment I realized this conversation had happened before I arrived. I asked my dad when exactly I had agreed to give up my ownership. He told me that I hadn't agreed yet, but he expected me to do the right thing. That sentence bothered me more than anything else, because suddenly the issue wasn't whether Evan needed help. It was whether refusing to hand over something I legally own made me selfish. I told my dad that I wasn't giving away my ownership. He got visibly angry. My mom started crying. My aunt looked down at her plate. My brother started explaining that this wasn't about money. That was when I almost laughed. The restaurant was worth a lot of money. Not millions, but enough that giving away half of it would have changed my financial situation considerably. I asked Evan what he planned to do with my share. He said he would keep the restaurant running. I asked whether he had enough money to buy me out. He said that wasn't what Dad meant. Dad wanted me to sign my interest over. No payment, no valuation, no accountant, no attorney, just a signature. I asked why we were discussing this at Thanksgiving instead of sitting down with the restaurant's accountant and a lawyer. My dad said I was making things complicated. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. He said if I didn't agree, Evan might lose the restaurant. I asked why. My dad wouldn't answer directly. He said Evan had obligations. I assumed he meant the restaurant had taken on debt. That wasn't unusual. Restaurants always have loans, equipment leases, payroll obligations, taxes, supplier accounts, and credit lines. I told my dad I wasn't signing anything that night. He said I was embarrassing him. I told him I was sorry he felt that way. Then I went home. I thought the whole thing would blow over after a few days. It didn't. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and a series of messages from my mother. She said I had ruined Thanksgiving. She said Evan was devastated. She said Dad had worked his whole life for that restaurant. She said I knew how important it was to him. None of those things answered my actual question. Why did Evan need my half? I spent most of that Friday thinking about that. I had been around the restaurant my whole life. I knew the building. I knew the employees. I knew the suppliers. I knew my mother had retired from doing the books several years earlier. I knew Evan had taken over accounting duties after that. I also knew I hadn't looked closely at the financial statements in years. That suddenly bothered me. I had been receiving annual tax documents, but I usually dropped them into a folder and sent everything to my accountant. I had trusted my family. That sounds stupid now. At the time, it seemed normal. My dad had always told me that family businesses survived because people trusted each other. I believed him. On Friday afternoon, I pulled out the folder where I kept old restaurant documents. There were tax returns, there were operating agreements, there were annual reports, there were ownership schedules, there were bank statements that my mother had mailed me years ago. I started comparing them. At first, I didn't see anything strange. Revenue went up and down, food costs fluctuated, payroll increased, there were equipment repairs, there was a loan for a kitchen renovation. Nothing immediately looked like fraud. Then I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. There were several recurring payments to a company called Hospitality Services. The name sounded vaguely familiar. I had seen it on previous statements. I assumed it was some kind of vendor. Then I looked at the address. It was not the restaurant. It wasn't an equipment supplier either. It was a mailbox address. I searched through old emails and found an invoice attached to a message from Evan. The invoice was for consulting services. The amount was $4,800. The next month there was another one, then another. I started adding them up. Over 18 months, the restaurant had paid Hospitality Services more than $70,000. That got my attention. I called the restaurant's accountant. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply told him I was reviewing old ownership records and had questions about several expenses. He was polite. Then he became careful. He said he couldn't discuss certain financial information with me without confirming my ownership status and authorization. I told him I was a member of the LLC. He paused. Then he said he knew that. That pause bothered me. I asked if there was any reason my ownership rights had changed. He said he couldn't answer that without looking at the current operating documents. I asked him to send me whatever records I was entitled to receive as an owner. He said he would have to check with Evan. I ended the call feeling worse than when I started. I wasn't sure whether I was uncovering something or just becoming paranoid because of Thanksgiving. That night, I called my mom. I didn't mention the company. I asked her whether she knew what Hospitality Services was. There was a long silence. Then she said she thought it was one of Evan's consulting arrangements. I asked what Evan was consulting about. She said she didn't know. I asked whether she had ever handled payments to that company. She said no. Then she asked why I was looking at it. I told her I was trying to understand why Dad suddenly wanted me to give Evan my ownership. My mom started crying again. She said Dad believed Evan was under financial pressure. I asked what kind of pressure. She didn't know. That was the first time I realized my mother might not actually know what was happening either. I apologized for upsetting her. Then I asked her one more thing. I asked whether she remembered transferring the restaurant ownership to me and Evan. She said yes. She told me Dad had always intended for us to own it equally. That mattered, because my dad had made it sound like I was some outsider who had been handed something I didn't deserve. I wasn't. I had been given half because that was the plan. The next Monday, I made an appointment with an attorney who handled business and property matters. I brought every document I had. I told him I wasn't looking for a fight. I wanted to know what I owned. He reviewed the operating agreement, the membership records, and the tax documents. Then he asked me if I had signed anything recently. I said no. He asked whether anyone had told me my ownership percentage had changed. I said no. He told me that based on the documents I had provided, I still owned my half. That was reassuring. Then he asked why my family wanted me to surrender it. I told him I wasn't sure. I showed him the payments to Hospitality Services. He looked at them carefully. He didn't say they were illegal. He didn't say they were proof of anything. He simply told me that related party transactions deserved to be examined carefully, especially if one member was benefiting from company funds. I asked what I should do. He told me not to accuse anyone. He told me not to threaten anyone. He told me not to sign anything. He also told me to formally request the company's financial records. That was the first time I understood that being calm didn't mean being passive. I could be calm and still protect myself. I sent the formal request that week. A few days later, Evan called me. He sounded exhausted. He said he couldn't believe I had gone to a lawyer. I told him I hadn't sued anyone. I had asked to inspect financial records for a business I owned. He said Dad felt betrayed. I asked him why Dad was so determined to get my ownership. He said the restaurant was struggling. I asked how badly. He said there were cash flow problems. I asked whether the restaurant owed taxes. He said every business had taxes. I asked whether payroll was current. He said yes. I asked whether there were unpaid suppliers. He said not anything serious. I asked why he needed my share. He said he didn't want to have this conversation over the phone. Then he told me he would call me later. He didn't. Instead, the next morning I received an email from the restaurant's accountant. It contained several years of financial statements. I spent most of Saturday going through them. The first thing I noticed was that revenue hadn't collapsed. It had actually increased. Profit had decreased. That can happen. Restaurants can have higher revenue and lower profit because costs rise, but the numbers didn't make sense. Food costs were up. Labor costs were up, repair expenses were up, and consulting fees had appeared out of nowhere. I compared the numbers year by year. The consulting payments grew at almost exactly the same time Evan became the manager. Then I looked at the company name, EM Hospitality Services, Evan's initials. That still didn't prove anything. I searched the business records available through the county office. The company was registered to a person named Evan M. The mailing address was different from the restaurant. The registered agent was a commercial service. The company had been created less than 2 months after Evan became general manager. I stared at that screen for a long time. I remember feeling embarrassed, not angry, embarrassed, because I had spent years telling people my brother was the one holding the family business together. I had defended him when my dad complained that I wasn't involved enough. I had told relatives that Evan worked harder than anyone. Maybe he did. Maybe he was also taking money out of the business. I didn't know yet. I needed more information. The accountant sent me additional records after my attorney formally requested them. There were invoices, bank statements, credit card statements, payroll reports, vendor lists. I started building a spreadsheet. It felt ridiculous. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee getting cold beside my laptop, categorizing expenses from my family's restaurant. But the more I organized, the clearer the pattern became. The restaurant had paid EM Hospitality Services for consulting. The company had no employees listed. There was no office. There were no detailed consulting reports. There were only invoices. Some invoices had vague descriptions like operational strategy or management support. One had the phrase emergency business restructuring. The restaurant had paid $9,500 for that service. There was no restructuring. At least none that I could find. The restaurant had also paid EM Hospitality Services $12,000 for marketing. But the marketing work was apparently performed by a local advertising company that the restaurant had separately paid. That made my stomach tighten. I called my attorney. He told me to keep documenting everything. He said I shouldn't contact Evan about specific allegations until we knew more. He also told me that the most important thing was preserving original records. I backed up everything. I kept the original emails. I printed the statements. I downloaded copies of the invoices. I saved the corporate filings. I made a timeline. I even wrote down the date and approximate time of conversations with my family, not because I wanted to build some dramatic case, because I was starting to realize that memories were unreliable when families were angry. Documents weren't. About a week later, my dad came to my house. He looked tired. He had a folder under his arm. He told me he wanted to settle this like a family. I invited him inside. He sat at my kitchen table. For almost an hour, he talked about the restaurant. He talked about how hard he had worked. He talked about his first loan. He talked about my mother working nights. He talked about me washing dishes when I was 15. He talked about Evan practically growing up behind the counter. Everything he said was true. That was what made it difficult. My dad wasn't inventing our history. He was using our history to make me feel guilty about the present. He eventually pulled papers from the folder. They were ownership transfer documents. The transfer would give Evan my membership interest. There was no purchase price. The document described it as a family transfer. My dad told me signing it would prevent the restaurant from being torn apart. I asked whether Evan had reviewed the restaurant's financials. Dad said, of course. I asked whether Evan had told him about EM Hospitality Services. My dad became very still. I asked whether he knew that the restaurant had paid more than $70,000 to that company. He said those were legitimate expenses. I asked whether he knew the company belonged to Evan. He said Evan had a consulting business. I asked why the restaurant paid his consulting company instead of paying him through payroll. My dad said he didn't understand all the accounting details. I told him I didn't either. That was why I wanted an accountant to review everything. He became angry. He said I was treating my brother like a criminal. I told him I wasn't. I said I was asking questions. He stood up. He told me I was going to destroy the family. Then he left the papers on my table. I didn't sign them. That night my mother called. She said Dad was furious. She said Evan was considering leaving the restaurant. I asked whether she had seen the financial statements. She said no. I told her she should. She didn't answer. The next morning she asked me to send them. I did. 3 days later she called me crying. She said she had found something. I went to her house. She had spread old restaurant documents across her dining room table. She had pulled records from the years when she was still handling the books. She showed me invoices from before Evan became manager. There had been no consulting company. There were no strange recurring payments. She then showed me an old ownership schedule. It listed me and Evan as equal owners. She said Dad had never changed that. I told her I knew. Then she showed me something else. It was a handwritten note from my dad. It was dated several years earlier. He had written that the restaurant was supposed to be our inheritance, split equally. My mother had kept it because she said my dad wanted to remember what he promised us. That note wasn't a legal document. It didn't prove ownership. But it showed that my dad's current argument wasn't what he had originally intended. My mother asked me whether I thought Evan had stolen money. I told her I didn't know. She said she didn't want to believe it. Neither did I. That was the hardest part. I didn't want my brother to be a thief. I wanted there to be an innocent explanation. Maybe Hospitality Services really did provide services. Maybe the invoices were poorly documented. Maybe Evan had borrowed money from the restaurant and planned to repay it. Maybe Dad had been trying to protect him because he was embarrassed about something unrelated. I kept looking. Then I found the first thing that made my uncertainty disappear. There was a bank transfer from the restaurant to Hospitality Services for $18,000. 3 days later, there was a payment from Hospitality Services to a credit card company. The credit card account wasn't the restaurant's. It belonged to Evan. I didn't know what the charge was for. I didn't need to guess. The accountant found the corresponding invoice. It was labeled Business Debt Restructuring. The payment had gone toward a personal credit card balance. I sent the record to my attorney. He told me this was significant. He also told me not to confront Evan. That advice became harder to follow after Evan came to the restaurant one evening and found me there. I had gone because my attorney had recommended that I inspect certain records in person. I wasn't sneaking around. I had informed the accountant I was coming. Evan walked into the office while I was reviewing invoices. He looked at the papers. Then he looked at me. I remember how uncomfortable that room felt. It was the same little office where I had done homework as a kid, while my mom closed out the register. Now I was sitting there reviewing payments made by my brother. Evan asked what I was doing. I told him I was reviewing the company's records as an owner. He said I was trying to catch him doing something wrong. I told him I wasn't. He said Dad had been right about me. He said I only cared about money. That hurt. I reminded him that I hadn't asked for his share. He said I was acting like the restaurant belonged to me. I told him it belonged to both of us. He said he was the one who had worked there. I said I knew. He said I had no idea what it took to keep the doors open. I told him maybe I didn't. Then I asked him why the restaurant had paid his personal credit card. He stopped talking. That was the moment I knew not everything, but enough. He said it was complicated. I asked whether he planned to pay it back. He said he had already put the money back. I asked when. He said he didn't remember. I asked why the transfer was categorized as a consulting expense. He said that was how the accountant had told him to record it. I knew that wasn't true. The accountant had already told me that he had never instructed Evan to classify personal debt as consulting. Evan eventually left the office. He didn't apologize. He didn't threaten me. He just left. I went home feeling sick. I spent that night wondering whether I had made a mistake by looking. Maybe ignorance would have been easier. For a few days, things were quiet. Then I received a letter from an attorney representing my brother. It accused me of interfering with restaurant operations. It claimed I was attempting to damage the business. It demanded that I stop contacting employees and vendors. My attorney reviewed it. He told me that, as an owner, I had rights. He also told me not to use those rights recklessly, so I stopped communicating directly with employees. Everything went through the accountant or my attorney. That made things slower. It also made things cleaner. Then the restaurant's bank called me. That was unexpected. The bank wanted to verify information related to an ownership matter. I initially thought it was a mistake. The bank representative explained that there was a pending request involving the restaurant's credit line. Evan had apparently tried to refinance some of the business debt. The bank needed documentation from both members. I asked what documentation. They needed proof of ownership. I sent the operating agreement and ownership schedule. The bank representative told me they had received a different document claiming Evan owned the entire company. That was the first time I realized my brother might have tried to represent himself as the sole owner. I asked for a copy. The bank couldn't provide everything to me because of privacy rules, but my attorney was able to obtain the relevant documents through the formal process. The document was a version of the operating agreement showing Evan with 100% ownership. It was dated several months earlier. I had never seen it. My signature wasn't on it. My attorney checked the state business records. The public filing still showed the original ownership structure. That didn't prove who had prepared the false document, but it meant the bank had been given information inconsistent with the official records. The refinance was delayed. Then the bank asked the restaurant for additional documentation. That created a problem for Evan. The restaurant needed money, but now nobody could simply take my ownership away to solve the problem. A week later, my dad called me. He sounded different. He wasn't angry. He sounded scared. He said the bank was asking questions. I told him that wasn't my fault. He said Evan had told him I had caused the problem. I told him I hadn't. I explained exactly what I had done. I had requested records. I had provided ownership documents. I had not contacted the bank to sabotage anything. My dad didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he asked me whether I really thought Evan had done something wrong. I told him I thought the records deserved an independent review. He said he couldn't believe his own son was doing this. I didn't know whether he meant me or Evan. Then he asked whether I would give Evan my share if he repaid everything. I said I wasn't discussing a transfer until the finances were understood. He said I was being stubborn. I told him I was being careful. The restaurant eventually hired an outside accountant. That was the first decision anyone made that actually felt reasonable. The outside accountant reviewed 3 years of records. I didn't participate. Neither did my dad. Evan provided the records through the restaurant. The review took almost 2 months. During that time, family relationships became strange. Thanksgiving had been replaced by silence. My mom stopped attending family dinners. My dad would send short messages about practical matters. My brother stopped responding to me. My aunt told me she didn't know what to believe. My cousins asked whether the restaurant was going to close. I told everyone the same thing. I didn't know. That was difficult because people wanted certainty. They wanted me to say Evan had stolen money. They wanted me to say Dad had lied. They wanted someone to be the villain. I couldn't honestly do that. I knew there were suspicious transactions. I knew there was a false ownership document. I knew restaurant money had been used to pay a personal credit card, but I didn't know the full story. The outside accountant eventually finished. My attorney called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He told me the review had found approximately $146,000 in questionable transactions. Some were clearly personal. Some were poorly documented. Some appeared to be legitimate business expenses but had been paid through Evan's company. The accountant couldn't determine whether every dollar was improper, but there was enough evidence that the restaurant's financial statements needed correction. There was also a tax issue. Some expenses had been deducted as business expenses even though they appeared personal. The accountant recommended amended filings. That meant the restaurant could owe additional taxes, interest, and possibly penalties. I remember sitting in my car outside my office when I heard that. I wasn't happy. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about how easily this could have destroyed the restaurant. My family had spent decades building it. One bad stretch of decisions could undo all of that. Then I learned something else. Evan had borrowed money personally using the restaurant as part of the financial picture. The restaurant wasn't directly responsible for all of his personal debts, but the distinction had become blurred. My attorney told me that was probably why Dad had been so desperate for me to transfer my ownership. If Evan controlled 100% of the company, he could make decisions without me. He could potentially restructure the business more aggressively. He could sell assets. He could negotiate with creditors. He could use the company's value to address his personal situation. I didn't know whether that was exactly what he intended, but it explained why my ownership had suddenly become a problem. For the first time, Thanksgiving made sense. Dad hadn't been asking me for a favor. He had been asking me to surrender my position before I understood what was happening. That realization hurt more than the money. I had always thought my dad's favoritism was mostly emotional. Evan was the son who stayed. Evan worked with him. Evan knew the restaurant. Dad defended him. I thought that was the whole story. It wasn't. My dad had been protecting Evan financially, maybe because he felt responsible, maybe because he was afraid the restaurant would collapse, maybe because he couldn't accept that his son had made serious mistakes. Probably all three. The legal process took longer than I expected. Nobody went to jail. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was no judge slamming a gavel. It was mostly paperwork, meetings, accountants, attorneys, amended records, and uncomfortable conversations. Evan had to reimburse the restaurant for transactions that were determined to be personal. Some of the money was paid back over time. Some was offset against amounts he had taken as distributions. The tax filings were corrected. The ownership records were formally confirmed. The questionable version of the operating agreement was withdrawn. I never found out exactly who had created it. Evan eventually admitted he had given a copy to the bank. He said he thought he had a right to describe himself as the controlling owner because he ran the restaurant. That explanation didn't make sense to me, but I could believe that he had convinced himself it was true. People do strange things when they are scared. He wasn't some cartoon villain sitting in a dark room planning to destroy the family. He was a guy who had gotten into debt, started moving money around, and kept making decisions that required another decision to hide the first one. That was probably the most disturbing part. There was no single moment when he became dishonest. It seemed to happen gradually. One expense, then another, one personal charge, then another, one explanation, then another. By the time I noticed, the story was much bigger than the first mistake. The restaurant survived, barely. The bank approved a smaller restructuring after the financial review. My share remained intact. Evan stayed involved in operations, but he was no longer solely responsible for the books. An outside accounting firm handled the financial reporting. We also created rules requiring both owners to approve certain transactions. My dad hated that. He said it made the family business feel like a corporation. I told him that was the point. Family relationships weren't a substitute for financial controls. For several months, my dad barely spoke to me. That hurt more than I expected. I had spent my entire life wanting his approval. Even after everything, part of me still wanted him to call and tell me I had done the right thing. He didn't. Instead, he complained to my mother that I had embarrassed him. My mother eventually told him that he had embarrassed himself by asking me to sign away my ownership without telling me what was happening. That was the first time I heard her stand up to him about the situation. Their marriage became strained. They didn't separate, but the restaurant stopped being the center of their lives. My mother started helping the outside accountant understand the older records. That turned out to be useful. She knew where everything was. She remembered why certain vendors had been used. She could explain old deposits and equipment purchases. She also discovered that Evan had stopped maintaining some of the old filing systems. It wasn't malicious. He simply hadn't cared about the details. My mom told me that she had spent years believing she was the only person who understood the restaurant's finances. Then she retired. She assumed Evan would learn. He hadn't. That explained some of the chaos. It didn't excuse the personal transactions, but it explained why the business had become vulnerable. About 6 months after Thanksgiving, Evan and I finally met alone. We sat in a coffee shop because neither of us wanted to meet at the restaurant. He looked older. I probably did too. He told me he was sorry. He said he had been drowning financially. He had accumulated credit card debt. His wife had medical bills from an earlier year that their insurance hadn't fully covered. They had also taken on expenses after buying their house. He said he thought the restaurant was doing better than it was. He said every time he took money, he believed he could replace it after the next good month. Then the next good month didn't come. I listened. I didn't forgive him immediately, but I understood him better. I asked him why he had gone along with Dad's plan to take my share. He said he thought if he owned everything, he could sell the restaurant or refinance it without having to explain everything to me. I asked whether he had intended to sell. He said he didn't know. He admitted that he had been desperate. I asked him whether Dad knew about the personal payments. He said Dad knew some of it. That was another painful discovery. My dad hadn't known every detail, but he knew enough to understand that Evan was in trouble. That was why he had pushed me so hard. Evan told me Dad had said I would never agree if I knew the numbers. I told him he was right. Evan looked down at the table. He said he knew. For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my brother instead of someone defending a position. I told him I wasn't trying to take the restaurant from him. He said he knew. I told him I didn't want to run it. He said he knew that too. Then I told him that ownership still mattered. He nodded. We didn't hug, we didn't have some emotional movie moment. We finished our coffee and left, but things became less hostile after that. My brother started attending the financial meetings. He accepted the new accounting controls. He stopped using the restaurant's accounts for personal expenses. He sold one of his vehicles to pay down some of his personal debt. His wife took on more work. They cut their household spending. None of it was glamorous. It was just what happens when people have to deal with numbers they spent too long avoiding. The restaurant slowly recovered. The outside accountant found several expenses that could be reduced. We renegotiated some supplier contracts. We stopped paying for unnecessary services. The monthly reports became much clearer. Within a year, the restaurant was profitable again, not wildly profitable, just healthy. That was enough. My dad eventually started working fewer hours. He had been talking about retirement for years. Now he actually did it. He still visited the restaurant. He still complained about the coffee. He still thought the booths were too dark. Some things never changed. But he stopped trying to control the finances. That took longer. One afternoon, I was at the restaurant reviewing a quarterly report when he sat across from me. He didn't mention the money. He didn't mention Evan. He just looked at the report and asked whether things were better. I told him they were. He nodded. Then he said he had been wrong about something. I waited. He said he had believed protecting Evan meant protecting the family. He said he hadn't understood that hiding problems only made them bigger. I didn't know what to say, so I told him I understood why he was scared. I also told him I couldn't pretend what happened was okay. He said he knew. That was probably the closest we ever came to an apology. My mother was different. She apologized directly. She said she should have asked more questions when Dad first told her I was going to give Evan my share. I told her she had been put in a difficult position. She said that wasn't an excuse. She had spent years believing that keeping peace was the same thing as helping. She told me she was learning the difference. That stuck with me, because I realized I had been doing something similar. I had kept peace by not asking questions. I had accepted my dad's explanations. I had assumed the restaurant was fine because nobody told me otherwise. I had treated family trust like a substitute for documentation. It wasn't. The most embarrassing part of the entire thing was that I had received financial statements for years. I could have looked. I simply didn't. I wasn't responsible for my brother's decisions, but I was responsible for not understanding what I owned. That lesson changed how I handled everything afterward. I reviewed my own retirement accounts. I checked my insurance policies. I updated my will. I made sure I knew where my important documents were. I kept copies of property records. I stopped assuming that paperwork was somebody else's problem. That doesn't mean I became paranoid. I still trust people. I just don't confuse trust with the absence of records. A year after Thanksgiving, the family had another Thanksgiving dinner. It was at my parents' house. The table was smaller because some relatives couldn't make it. The restaurant was doing well enough that Evan had closed early that day. My dad made the turkey. My mother made too many side dishes. My aunt brought a pie. Everything felt almost normal. Almost. At one point, my dad passed me a dish and our hands touched. Neither of us said anything. Then Evan sat down across from me. He had brought a bottle of wine. He said he wanted to toast to the restaurant making it through the year. I didn't know whether to laugh, so I just raised my glass. The toast wasn't about me. It wasn't about Dad. It wasn't even about what happened. It was simply about the fact that the business was still there. After dinner, I helped clear plates. My mom asked me whether I regretted not giving Evan my share. I told her no. Then I thought about it for a second. I told her I regretted that we had ever reached the point where she had to ask. That was more honest. I didn't regret protecting myself. I regretted needing to. There were still consequences. My relationship with my brother never went completely back to what it had been. We were civil. Sometimes we were genuinely close, but there was a permanent layer of caution between us. I didn't resent him every day. I didn't think about the money every time I saw him, but I also didn't leave important documents sitting on a table because I assumed family would handle them honestly. That was probably healthy. My dad and I slowly rebuilt our relationship too. It took years. There were still things we didn't discuss. He never fully explained why he had believed I would simply surrender half the restaurant. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he didn't want to admit how desperate he had been. Maybe he genuinely thought family obligation outweighed legal ownership. I stopped needing to know. The restaurant eventually became more of a business and less of a family inheritance. We hired a manager. My brother focused on operations. I remained a member and participated in major decisions. My dad retired completely. My mom helped with occasional bookkeeping questions but stayed out of daily operations. It was healthier that way. The restaurant also changed physically. We replaced the old booths. We repaired the neon sign. We updated the kitchen equipment. We added online ordering. For the first time in decades, the place felt like it belonged to the future instead of the past. I think that was what my dad had actually been afraid of. He thought giving Evan control would preserve everything. Instead, what preserved it was admitting that the old way wasn't working. The strangest part is that I never wanted to be involved this much. I didn't want to become the guy checking bank statements and reviewing vendor contracts. I didn't want to know how much cooking oil cost. I didn't want to learn what a restaurant's labor percentage should look like. But once I realized the business was partly mine, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't sit back and say it wasn't my problem. That Thanksgiving dinner changed that. I still think about the moment my dad told me I was giving Evan my share. At the time, I thought the hardest part was being treated unfairly. Now I think the hardest part was realizing how little I actually knew. I had assumed my family was asking me for a sacrifice. They were actually asking me to make a decision without giving me the information necessary to make it. Those are very different things. If I had signed that transfer, I probably would have spent the rest of my life wondering what happened. Maybe the restaurant would have survived. Maybe Evan would have fixed everything. Maybe my dad would have been right, but I would have given away something worth a significant amount of money without understanding why. And once that signature was on paper, getting it back would have been much harder than refusing to sign it. I didn't win because I was smarter than everyone else. I didn't win because I trapped my brother. I didn't even really feel like I won. I just slowed everything down. I asked questions. I kept copies. I let professionals review the records. I refused to sign something I didn't understand. That was enough. The documents did most of the work. The bank records did most of the arguing. The accountant did most of the explaining. The truth didn't need me to scream about it. It only needed enough time to become impossible to ignore. I still have the original folder from that Thanksgiving. The ownership agreement is inside. So are the financial statements. So is the old handwritten note from my dad about splitting the restaurant equally. I keep it in a locked file cabinet now, not because I'm expecting another family war. I just learned that important things deserve to be kept somewhere safe. Every once in a while, I take the folder out. I look at the ownership agreement, then I put it back. I don't feel angry anymore. Mostly I feel relieved. Because there was a version of this story where I trusted everyone, signed the paper, and found out 6 months later that the restaurant was in financial trouble. There was another version where I got angry at Thanksgiving, accused my brother of stealing, and destroyed whatever chance we had of fixing things. Instead, I set my fork down. I asked questions. I waited. And when the answers finally came, they were already sitting in black and white on the pages in front of me. That's what I keep coming back to. My dad thought the strongest thing I could do for the family was give up my share. I eventually realized the strongest thing I could do was refuse to make a permanent decision based on someone else's panic. The restaurant survived. My brother survived his mistakes. My parents eventually accepted that protecting someone from consequences isn't the same as protecting them. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can say in a family argument isn't the loudest thing. Sometimes it's simply that you need to see the books first.